Since 1983, FAME has helped business and education work for Maine. Contact the authority, the Finance Authority of Maine.
Welcome. This is our Afterthoughts segment where we keep our guests around from our broadcast show for some extra conversation that you can only see on the web. We usually get a little more, drill down a little more in depth on some of the issues and get some good candid conversation going, so I'm glad we got them around. Today we're talking about broadband access in Maine in general, and with us today we have Fletcher Kittredge, CEO of GWI, Phil Lindley, Executive Director of the Connect Maine Authority, and Josh Broder, General Manager of Maine Fiber Company. Okay, yeah, like we said, we need about 17 hours to really talk about this, obviously. And as you mentioned, we'll be talking about this subject a lot because it really is, we are at the infancy of this, as you said. Talk about that a little bit. You were just mentioning that about, and then talk about, you know, how do we even know what's coming up?
Yes.
And how do we know that it's, what'd you say, future-proof? Was that what you?
Yeah. Okay.
I have trouble, I don't know if I believe that or not. Yeah. Didn't they say that about everything? Okay, go ahead.
All right, first, why we're at the infancy. I mean, no one buys an internet connection to have an internet connection. They buy it for what they can do with it. Mm-hmm. And what you can do with it is intimately connected to how fast it is, how reliable it is. And with this new speed and particularly reliability, which is, we don't talk about enough, but is incredibly important, a whole new set of applications are coming down the pipeline. And you see it first in business, the cloud computing, right, which is a buzzword, but it's really happening, and it really can save businesses a lot of money, and it can allow them to do things they've never done before. The idea of a cloud computing is if your business has a fast enough, cheap enough, reliable enough connection, many things that you used to, computing things that you used to do by hosting them in your business can be hosted somewhere else, in a big data center somewhere. And the advantage of this is you get huge economies of scale, which lets a small company have the cost structure and the features that only a big company could afford before, because they're sharing resources with many other small companies. Right. Google is Google's an example of this, but almost all computing companies are getting into cloud computing now, and it really works, and it really saves a lot of money. We've started doing it and been absolutely delighted.
So that's something that we should be looking for.
Yes, it's a business opportunity, yeah. And it's a business opportunity for Maine, in that Maine companies can cut their costs, and right. But also these data centers could be located in Maine.
We got cheap land and we got cheap workers. We really do. I mean, that's when we got to change the sign at Kittery. So welcome to Maine. We got cheap land, cheap workers.
Now if we can get cheap power, we'll really have something.
That's exactly right. If we can get our power down, and if we can have ubiquitous broadband that really is, and that people can really build on, why wouldn't you come? Now, at some point, then the land and the workers aren't any cheaper anymore because they've moved here.
Everybody's making a lot of money.
That's right, and that's a bad problem to have. Yeah. So, okay, Josh, I wanted to get back to you because you did mention. We're talking about the FCC and the wireless. So talk about that.
So the White House made an announcement this week about releasing a whole new block of spectrum. And the fun thing for the federal government, when they release spectrum, they get to sell it and auction it. Yep. And usually when they launch a new initiative around wireless, they can recoup the cost of that program through the auctioning of that spectrum. And when you look at each slug of development we've had in smartphones and PDAs and wireless phones, you can tie back each little growth spurt in sort of the knickknacks and the doodads that we get to use wirelessly to one of these auctions. So as the federal government goes out to auction this new group of spectrum, and they're doing it in a really coherent way with a federal policy around, look, we'd really like to steer it in some very specific directions. As consumers and business people, we'll see a new host of applications pop up. In Maine, we found that our wireless service hasn't been as fast in all the areas of the state as we'd like it to be. And one of the limitations of the wireless service is not just the waves that go through the air between your device and the tower, but it's getting the signal from that tower back to the internet.
There's a pipe somewhere.
Exactly. So the kind of fiber development, the fiber optic facilities that are terrestrial on the ground, are critical to support this next round of wireless development. So we think that the timing is really good to have a large fiber project here in Maine, because it will provide the baseline infrastructure that will allow each of these towers in each of these rural communities to be able to transmit all of this data that will come with these new applications back back to the internet. And if you can imagine, even 5 years ago, what the applications would be using today wirelessly on our iPhones and BlackBerries, you can only begin to start to brainstorm about what's coming in the next few years.
How does that get to the access issue for a rural state like this? What part does wireless, what's that going to play?
Well, for the mobile wireless, the announcement that came out this morning from the White House that 98% of the country would have access to the next generation of wireless access, and that's, you've heard 4G out there.
Right,
4G is analogous to a very good broadband connection. Whether that gets to all parts of Maine, whether we see it in Frenchville and Sinclair, after we see it in Portland.
The plan, I mean, what they're talking about is to 98% of the people, they're going to have wireless broadband access that is designed to be 5 times faster than the Maine state current Maine state standard for broadband definition. So it's huge.
And what's the timing on, what do you think the timing on something like that is?
I think this is coming relatively fast, and in large network deployments like this, 2 and 3 years is relatively fast.
That's very fast.
But what I think we have here is a perfect storm between already investing in the physical facilities to move this stuff around the state, the federal government making wireless spectrum available, and them opening up the Universal Services Fund to broadband development. Now you have really the sort of 3 legs of the stool here to provide
and all that cash sitting on the sideline is looking for a place to invest. I mean,
that's
how about
right.
That? Great.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe it's a good time. I mean, people are looking for what's the next big thing. Investors are too, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, what do I do?
Where did the spectrum come from, Josh?
This spectrum is reserve spectrum that the federal government has had socked away.
It's not the white space from the change of television?
No, actually, that spectrum's coming is still
So
sort
that's
of
still out
to
there.
be determined.
Okay.
And some of that's been reallocated.
Some of it's also been auctioned off as well. Some of the big cellular companies have gotten some of that.
Yeah, if people remember
the TV change from analog to digital.
Sure. So if people remember when TV came to cell phones just recently, that was a result of that spectrum being reallocated from analog TV back to cellular companies, essentially, who are beaming it to phones.
So once the basic infrastructure, just like any other, is put in place for the fiber optics, right? The part that you'll be doing in the 3-ring binder, and the other fiber optic parts that are already out there in the state. Will we need more of that, or is that that's going to be what we need to power to get the pipe to the right tower for the wireless as well?
I think the next phase of development will really be around last mile connectivity. It'll be fiber to the tower, fiber to the business, fiber to the home.
How's that going to happen?
That's going to come
in a rural state.
That's going to come from a variety of organizations, and realistically, in the most rural areas, it's going to come on the back of some kind of subsidy. But in areas that are rural but not hyper rural, I think we'll find that the facilities that we're building to get into those towns make it cheap enough that the limited money there is available for private investment can then be used to build out those last mile connections.
Is that what you think?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Good. I was interesting when the FCC making the change from the universal. I mean, they're really admitting that this thing is it's centuries. You're in the wrong century.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And it's poorly. The cost structure was wrong. And I mean, they're
The
paying $20,000 to maintain a phone.
Yes.
And that's
crazy.
There's higher numbers than that. There's scarier higher numbers, but it's,
And they do. I don't have to, but they do talk about the waste and the inefficiencies. That's what they're going to use to fund a lot of this other stuff.
well, there's the subsidy system's been around since the 80s, since the Bell system breakup, and the FCC Chairman Janikowski talked about things like phantom traffic, small rural telephone companies gaming the system,
right?
And a lot of that, if they obtain closure on those things, that frees up more money. But just the very fact of taking universal service money and not subsidizing narrowband copper, but now subsidizing broadband fiber, that's a huge change. It's a huge change.
And what I think is directly on the heels, and you're already starting to see these dockets appear at the FCC, is that right behind this shift around spectrum, around subsidy, around the Universal Services Fund, is the federal government playing some catch-up around the regulatory environment, which has really been oriented towards a legacy telephone system.
Right.
And I think you'll find that as you talk to people in the telecom community, depending on what company you're in and how you access federal subsidy, you have a different perspective on the politics of that. But I think everyone would agree that the system is antiquated and isn't that relevant to what we're seeing out in the field of people's needs.
You know, talking about big oil. Was it big phone that had the stranglehold on it? Was it the AT&T and Verizon's, and before that, whoever else that was? I forget who they are. They kind of helped it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was teeing one up for you.
Yes, it's true.
And I think you need.
But
on any given
that
year,
can only last so long too. I mean,
Well,
that's the
yeah.
point.
Yeah,
It's
well,
finally collapsing under its own weight.
And even those companies would argue that
Sure.
that
They
the current
wanna get
regulatory
on-
structure isn't serving them.
Yeah,
They wanna get in on the other.
They want to change it, but Maine needs to watch out.
Okay.
Because
What for?
Well, in any given year, if you look at when they release the industry breakdowns for lobbyists in Washington,
Yep.
telecom is 1 or 2.
Yep.
So more people, more lobbying dollars are spent by this. These are federal programs, and when they make the rules, they don't necessarily think of Maine, and Maine is pretty close to unique at this point. In fact, it may be unique. We don't have AT&T or Verizon here anymore as a landline provider.
Right.
So, do they really think about a regulatory environment which involves Fairpoint as the incumbent? So there aren't there are 3 of those states: Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. We are the most rural by far.
Right.
We have, I mean, if you look at the map, we're so much bigger than the other 3, and we literally have needs that are unique to us, and it's everyone working together to make sure that when the FCC comes up with good rules, that that there aren't necessarily any lobbyists speaking for Maine.
You know, in terms of just kind of the I don't know, the meta message on this whole thing, if regular folks out there really understood that we were at 21st and what that really meant, and this has everything to do with where business and politics kind of crossed, and that's why things got stuck in a certain way, and that drives policy. And I think an email I saw from you would drive. There would be a revolt if other countries had to, if their internet was as slow as ours.
Right. In France,
if we could let other people know that, if they would know that, if that would help make that policy shift. In other words, yes, we want to spend our money there. I don't know.
Well, everybody thinks their own stuff is important, but I really believe.
Don't Americans think they have
well,
the best?
I mean, in our
they assume they do, but it's not true.
Oh no,
it's way from true. It's
and that is going to have an economic impact over time,
right?
Because it is just beginning to affect competitiveness, but the effect on competitiveness as it becomes more important will be greater and greater and greater. And time spent educating yourself on these things is time well spent.
Can we catch up?
I think we can. And what we need to make sure is that our intellectual economy is a trucking company on the highway, not a trucking company on the back roads. So we need to make sure that we have the same facilities or better facilities than other economies we want to compete with. And we want to compete with other states, and we want to compete with other countries. So we need to make sure we have the very best. And as federal changes really drive investment, we need to make sure that we have a coherent and clear policy, and we take a leadership role.
Phil and his authority are doing a great job, but the resources, the federal resources, are so much greater.
Right.
Your budget is usually a few million a year.
Yeah, less than $2 million a year.
Yeah, and the amount of money we're talking about. Lots of people come to this state and benefit from this state who aren't residents of this state, and we really need the federal investment. We should stay right on it.
Yep.
And to our delegation's credit, I think they're quite engaged in these issues.
Speaking of policy, then there is a state policy level as well that affects all of this. What do you think of the new administration? How do you think they will land on this issue?
I've seen no signs yet myself. I
early?
think yeah.
Well, I mean,
yeah, I think it's too early.
One thing we do know is that they are oriented.
They like federal money, I guess.
Well, they are oriented to businesses and economic development.
Yep.
And it's clear that
they're listening.
And it's very clear that broadband is necessary for economic development, for the growth of small businesses. There was a study I just read today, Michigan, I think. Connect Michigan, and I'll have to double check that state, but they did a study that determined that on average, businesses that had access to the internet had a substantially higher net revenue.
Yeah.